I've been in fandom for a long time, but when I first heard about Omegaverse in 2013, it had already been a phenomenon for several years, and come to completely dominate its original fandom. I didn't bother looking into it at the time. It seemed like a fairly obscure and mostly unappealing fetish, kept primarily quarantined in the Super Hulock fandom, which I had gotten over by that point. I cared about mature television, like, Hannibal. Yeesh. But over the next few years, I began to notice a trend. It leaked out into my other fandoms like lead into a water supply, or Misha Collins's blown-out ass at a Walmart. Heat and rut had always been a presence, with its crossover with sex pollen and other fuck-or-die tropes, but there began to be more specificity to these fics. Today, Omegaverse is a juggernaut among fanworks, especially for gay male ships, and has become a sizable niche in published erotica and doujins, with an entire doujin collective known as the Omegaverse Project, developing among artists in the subgenre, just to contain all of it. The Alpha Beta Omega tag on AO3 has over 80,000 works under it as of my writing, and it only goes up. Tens of thousands of people coming together to write about wolfcock. Omegaverse is special. Its content gives us particular insight into the trends of fandom, the whats and whys of our desires, broadly speaking, as fans. I'm going to try to do my best to interpret that, starting from the beginning. Part 1. Omegaverse History Lesson. Before we begin, this video will contain discussions of rape and dubious consent, part and parcel with typical Omegaverse, as well as pregnancy, misogyny, transphobia, and homophobia. If these topics upset you, I encourage you to tread carefully from here on out. Presumably, if you're watching this video now, you've seen Lindsay Ellis's Into the Omegaverse, which gives an overview of ABO as a subgenre, but is a bit scant on details. As we're going to be delving a little deeper into the subject today, it's only appropriate to get a little more anatomical. Omegaverse became codified in the supernatural fandom, but its roots go back slightly further. Pack dynamics have been a trope of werewolf-centered media for decades, lately growing more in popularity compared to the lone wolf narratives of the Wolfman and an American werewolf in London and so on. The pack dynamic is based on flawed studies published by L. David Mech in 1970, in which Mech reported on social structures in packs which were artificially created in captivity with inadequate resources, causing hierarchies to form as the more dominant wolves were able to take their pick of food and mates. In reality, further research discovered that packs occurring in the wild are family units, children living with parents until they are prepared to leave and form their own packs. But regardless of facts or logic, the myth of the alpha-beta low-wolf pack structure has remained well entrenched in pop culture. Fan archives from the before times are scarce on the ground, being purged or lost to time, so it's not always clear where a trend started. Pack dynamics pre-Omegaverse seem to have been popular with subsets of Harry Potter fans, particularly those interested in Sirius and Remus, a dog shapeshifter and werewolf respectively. The earliest backdated references on AO3 to ABO dynamics refer to alpha roles, but the physiological distinctions among pack members haven't been established yet. Heat or mating season was also a well-trodden smut trope, dating at least all the way back to the original run of Star Trek, and the fans' imaginations running wild with the concept of Pon farr, the frenzied Vulcan breeding imperative. Furry culture was also beginning to spread more into the online mainstream around this time. In anime like Tokyo Mew Mew, Inuyasha, and Spice and Wolf, we're introducing Western audiences to kimono mimi, people with animal ears or other animal traits for the purposes of being cute. Werewolf alternate universes and their associated pack dynamics quickly took off in the supernatural fandom. However, a facet of supernatural werewolves is that instead of this, or even this, presumably due to budget limitations, they look like this. Highly humanoid werewolves were more the norm than the traditional furry werewolves, which opened up the kink to people who weren't ready to commit fully to fur. According to the fanlore website on May 10th, 2010, a prompt was posted anonymously to a supernatural kink meme requesting RPF, real person fic, of the two lead actors of the show, Jared Padalecki and Jensen Ackles, with some pretty specific rules.
Hey you, their world is just like ours, except in their world there are two types of men. One is the alpha male, the other is the bitch male. Alpha males are like any ordinary guy, with the exception of their cocks. They work just like dog cocks, the knot, tons of cum, etc. The bitch male is just an ordinary guy without the special cock. I'd like to see alpha male Jared and bitch male Jensen. Jensen is a snotty prude, think lady from Lady and the Tramp. He may be a bitch male, but he's not just going to let anybody take a go at his sweet little ass. Until he meets Jared. Then prudy little Jensen turns cock slut for Jared. Bonus points for J2 being OTP. Jensen was a virgin before Jared, and now they met each other. It's for life. Completely up to you if mating happens just anywhere, like in the middle of the sidewalk, in a park, etc., or on a more private level.
In response, the Trampverse was begun in July of that year to fill the prompt. In November and then January of 2011, a similar prompt was posted to two other kink memes which officially put names to alpha, beta, and omega roles.
There are three types of men: alpha males, beta males, and omega males. Alpha males are like any ordinary guy, with the exception of their cocks. They work just like canines, the knot, tons of cum, strong breeders, etc. The beta male is an ordinary guy, without the special cock. Omega males are capable of childbearing and often called bitch males.
A note of something which caught my attention during research. There are also several other supernatural kink meme fills on AO3 tagged for ABO Dynamics, erroneously backdated to 2009 for some reason, but written in 2015. As far as I can tell, the Trampverse prompt and response were the actual beginnings of ABO, but it really is so typically fandom to twist the truth for the dumbest possible clout. The features of modern Omegaverse vary widely between portrayals, but the general rules are, on top of typical male and female gender assignments, there are three different expressions of sex: alpha, beta, and omega. Alphas are at the top of the social totem pole, while omegas are the lowest. Alphas, male and female, have penises with a knot and cum buckets, and omegas, male and female, are capable of bearing children. Omegas are frequently more fertile than betas or alphas and produce excessive slick during sex or heat. Traditionally, this is because anal impreg was the norm for Omegaverse, and writers wanted to avoid the preparation involved in realistic anal, though over time this has fallen out of favor. Other features include mating cycles, i.e. heat and rut, the insatiable urge to breed and associated pheromones, claiming bites, which cause an alpha and omega to be mated for life. Scenting and scent marking is a social activity, as well as scent and heat blockers, which allow alphas and omegas to pass as betas or suppress their urges. As hinted at by the original prompt, the main appeal of Omegaverse is the extreme feminization of omegas, in contrast to the safe, strong masculinity of alphas. Aside from occasional cases of subversion, omegas are portrayed as small, weak, soft, neotenous, and usually younger than their partners, helpless to the whims of their bodies and those of the more dominant alphas. Although alphas are sometimes portrayed as brutish or violent, it's usually the omega whose entire personality is overwritten by simply being an omega. And this is the part where I have to talk about yaoi. Part 2. The part where I have to talk about yaoi. If you know anything about yaoi and you haven't completely suppressed all your memories of middle school, the tropes of Omegaverse should already be a little familiar to you. Some people might be tempted to conflate yaoi and all modern slash, and this would be a mistake. Yaoi is more than just shipping, but arguably a series of tropes which bear more than a passing resemblance to Omegaverse. The most important of these is the hard defining line between the seme, or top, and uke, or bottom. It's worth noting that though these terms are Japanese, they are not self-identifiers for gay Japanese men. Yaoi has always been made primarily by and for women, and bara comics, or gay komi, made by and for queer men, don't tend to contain most of the cliches yaoi is known for. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about the role of queer men in porn for women, that the distance from their experiences as women and from the bodies of women allows them to explore complicated topics and sexuality with a kind of barrier. And I sympathize with that perspective. Women in popular media tend to be underwritten compared to their male counterparts, and mainstream male-female erotica and porn can be alienating and violent. Personally, my take as a is that regardless of the personal benefits, it's still pretty unhelpful in the long run to treat someone's sexuality as a fetish. When those people tell you that your depictions are demeaning and uncomfortable and you don't listen to them, or tell them that they're being oversensitive or policing you, I think that betrays a really unfortunate attitude that you hold towards those people. Like arguing that straight men do it to lesbians, therefore you should have the right to do it to gay men, or that gay men shouldn't complain because lesbians have it worse, is a pretty weak argument, not to mention lacking compassion. I hope I don't come off as strawmanning here, because this is an argument that I've seen a lot from people talking about the liberatory value of yaoi for women, and I just really dislike that. If you're able to find it for free or willing to pay for the entire series of essays, Trisha Abigail Santos Fairman's article from the collection Women and Erotic Fiction deals with this phenomenon among women in religiously conservative environments, particularly in Indonesia and the Philippines. In Fairman's study, she concludes that the interest these women show in yaoi is primarily invested in self-exploration, and that it serves as a non-threatening medium through which readers are able to explore and positively confront their own sexual desires. But at the same time, fan engagement with yaoi and BL does not necessarily lead to a full rejection or critique of their society's heterosexism, and an acceptance of homosexuality as a valid mode of sexual and gender identity. Meaning that, although yaoi creates an outlet for escaping heteronormativity and its pressures on women and female desire, it does not make readers challenge it. I would argue that at least part of the reason for this is due to the way that yaoi replicates heteronormativity at its most basic level, despite the surface appearance of queer transgression. In yaoi, same and uke are more than simply sex roles, but social ones. Their sexual positions are clearly defined by their designs, their personalities. Semes are physically imposing, usually older, dominant and aggressive, cool and experienced, in contrast to the uke, who's usually younger, smaller, with little to no sexual experience, especially with men, and is more likely to be emotionally unstable, whether he's a crybaby or a tsundere spitfire. A common trope is that neither of these men will consider themselves gay, but that their partner is special enough to turn them. Additionally, a lot of classic yaoi like ginger romantica traffics in dubious consent or outright force during sexual encounters. As in most heterosexual erotica, particular importance is placed on penetrative sex, anally in this case. It is treated as the real sex act between men, and especially at first it is an act perpetrated by the seme against the uke. Images of crying or screaming ukes being held down or hiding their faces during penetration is a staple of the genre. Sex is something done for the gratification of the seme, which by his magnanimity he unlocks as a source of pleasure for his uke after the initial reluctance and pain. My take is that this is homophobic and really shitty. A bunch of people like myself who were young and in fandom and just discovering gay media for the first time learned about gayness and gay sexuality through yaoi, through this voyeurism of queer male pain and this fetish for roles, for the use of force. For many people, especially queer people themselves who grew up and into a more faceted and nuanced LGBT culture, a more faceted and nuanced understanding of ourselves and of sexuality, we were able to put those tropes away and acknowledge that even though they were our stepping stone, they were still really toxic ideas to be pumping into our brains. Fandom gays have been talking for a long time now about the issues with all of this fetishism. A lot of misinformation gets spread through yaoi culture about the way gay men have sex, and for some people it takes some unlearning to work through all of the myths about sexuality that yaoi helps to enforce. Penetrative sex, anal or vaginal, is not supposed to be painful if it's done right, and it's certainly not the be-all end-all of sex acts. Some people might gravitate towards top or bottom roles, but they're not reflective of anyone's personality, or whether they're submissive or dominant, or if they play with those kinds of roles at all. And at the end of the day, many people don't limit themselves to one thing or another. In fact, many queer people, men and women and others, have a full and satisfying sex life without penetration, and still others have full and satisfying romantic lives without sex, and still others have full and satisfying lives with friends and family and platonic partners. And you learn that that's normal. Not just normal, but worth celebrating, worth writing about. And that's being an adult. But not everyone grows out of it. Even now in fandom spaces there is an obsession with penetrative sex and with the roles of the top and bottom. It's one thing to make funny haha jokes about bratty bottoms or how only tops can drive, and it's entirely another to start actually conflating people's sexual preferences with their personality types. People in fandom have taken this beyond the pale. Grace eBooks, infamous heterosexual, made her bacon online by harassing people for having the wrong headcanon about who takes dick between John and Sherlock, like from the bad show Sherlock. The height of that drama was only about 4 years ago, and I know that time feels very long lately, and 4 years ago feels like an entirely different world, but it's honestly such a short span of time for queer rights worldwide and for media. And media, including fandom, often seeks to simplify the world, to remove critical thinking and nuance, in order to create something comfortable and easy to consume. No matter what beautiful and complex thing you have to flatten out to get there, the escapist familiarity, the fetish, must be fed. Part 3. Gender Fetish. Something I don't think is discussed enough outside of hard scholarship is the level of imposed heteronormativity from fans onto queer fantasies. This is a form of something that I'm sure has a real name, but that I've taken to calling the gender fetish. A constant need to reify, if not the literal representation of normative gender and sexuality, then the simulation of them. Gender fetish, as I use the term, is generally speaking not an exploration of these ideas and their complexity, but a smoothing out, a replication of these familiar ideas, and in erotica using them for personal gratification. Much of homophobia is based fundamentally in misogyny. In many cultures, historically and today, the most degrading thing for a man to be is a woman, and receiving penetration is considered womanly behavior. In ancient Greece, men could be disgraced if they were known to be bottoms, a role reserved for women and slaves. Most homophobic insults target perceived gender nonconformity. For men, words like fairy, sissy, pansy, queen, and many words specifically meant to slur people for being bottoms or coming off that way. In other words, being feminine. Essentially, if you fail to be a man, you lose the privileges of manhood and become a lower class of citizen in a system which relies on subjugating women and other non-men to maintain the hierarchy. So why do so many women gravitate towards this dynamic in yaoi and straight erotica? In her sociological breakdown of 50 Shades of Grey and pornography for women, hardcore romance, Eva Illouz seeks to investigate and explain the appeal for female audiences of replicating pre-feminist gender dynamics for sexual gratification, despite their inherent degradation.
Why is traditional masculinity pleasurable in fantasy? In other words, why are some of women's fantasies still caught in patriarchy? The pre-modern bonds between men and women were based on what we may call, metaphorically, a feudal social system. Men dominated women. That is, men received women's sexual and domestic services, in exchange for which men granted women their presumed protection. The traditional men provided economically for his dependents, women and children, and defended them with his body. This unequal social system was based on a bond of reciprocal dependence. Inequality, translated into protectiveness, thus contained undeniable forms of pleasure, an important one being the clarity of the gender roles it implied. In contrast, equality is intrinsically more muddled, because it cannot fix roles or values to roles. In that sense, equality is less pleasurable because it generates uncertainty and ambivalence. The second pleasure found in inequality is that in translating power into protectiveness, it creates a natural mutual dependency and thick emotional glue. Equality, on the contrary, does not create a sense of obligation, but rather an awareness of each one's own needs and rights, which can potentially conflict with the rights and needs of the other. The moral claims made by equality are thus, by definition, less emotionally binding to another. The third pleasure found in inequality resides in the fact that when they are not negotiated, roles generate emotions that are more spontaneous and immediate, because well-scripted social roles do not require negotiation, or even reflexiveness, a capacity to reflect on the relation itself while it is unfolding. Egalitarian norms unscript roles and identities, and turn relationships into entities that must be negotiated through communication.
In Omegaverse, we find peak gender fetish. As in 50 Shades, a major aspect of the titillation of Omegaverse is in the deconstruction of modern equality and consent. The interplay of alphas and omegas simulates some of the most extreme aspects of a pre-modern gender relation. Alphas, semes, are our avatars of masculinity and power, protectors of omegas. Their role is to guard the omega's sexuality from the advances of other alphas, in a society of normalized non-consent. In return, omegas, ukes, provide companionship, children, and constant sexual availability. Through mating and marking, often in the throes of heat, they are able to form a permanent bond, a guarantee against loneliness or future complication. Mpreg has been a yaoi mainstay for decades, usually not at the forefront but always there. This was traditionally contrived by magic or fantasy biology, or simply not explained at all. The immediate appeal in most yaoi frameworks is fairly surface level. People want their MM-ship to be able to have a happy family with bio-babies, without any intermediaries, and play with the classic pregnancy tropes of that comfort barrier provided by queer male bodies. However, Omegaverse's particular obsession with mating and breeding illuminates another layer: the social control of pregnancy and procreation. Not all Omegaverse works feature pregnancy directly, and many don't even involve actual impregnation, but breeding is the very foundation of Omegaverse society. A common theme for more forceful stories is that Omegas, after being broken, acknowledge the pleasure of breeding and embrace their role wholeheartedly. They don't know why they struggled so much in the first place. The total submission of breeding scenarios, even among consent-conscious works, revels in the fetish of pregnancy. It is both holy and degrading, absolute fulfillment and absolute ego-destruction. They aren't real people having children because they personally want them. They are doing it because that's their archetype. That's what Omegas are supposed to do. Part 3, Part 2. Gender Defiance. Outside of fandom, trans people's bodies are subject to particular moral and sexual scrutiny. This most seriously affects trans women, who are simultaneously made into objects of desire and revulsion for cis straight men, and some cis lesbians. Just contrast the amount of trans girl porn and the obsession with girl dick and with the amount of vitriol and violence trans women face just for trying to exist. By comparison, trans masculine people are far less visible, and the outright disgust of cis people is often masked by infantilization. In Western culture, women's bodies are considered a site of purity and potential, and even many feminist groups strangely buy into this rhetoric. Therefore, trans men who choose to transition and reject womanhood must, in many people's minds, have been tricked, led astray, made to feel ashamed, and their purity must be protected from the inherent violence of masculinity. Even people who fully believe that trans men are men often still fall into the trap of infantilizing them as soft uwu flower boys, as having some inherent feminine purity that makes them ethereal and special. In recent years, there's been a paradigm shift in Western MM fandoms, assimilating trans men and trans masculine people into the gender fetish. Even if unintentional, looking at portrayals of MM trans fiction across many fandoms, we see a pattern emerge. Trans men are infantilized, feminized. Characters who are canonically sensitive or have other bottom traits are invariably the most likely to be headcanoned as transmasculine, while their shipping partners will usually remain cis men. Trans men written by cis women tend to be young, flat-chested, or post-top surgery but pre-bottom surgery, or uninterested in having it. Porn of these characters usually involves PIV sex, often with highly gendered terms for the trans guy's junk. Following these trends, typical omega males have become more and more often portrayed as essentially trans men. Rather than simply being small and weak with smaller than average penises, Omegaverse writers signal the femininity, the fertility of omegas through stereotypically trans bodies. In this framework, the transmasculine body is a soft, androgynous innocent, a man without the violent ability to penetrate, and that makes them incredibly desirable. To put it bluntly, boy pussy is the holy grail of yaoi. It is the formula for the ultimate uke. It circumvents the need for magic or scientific justifications for mpreg, as well as creating an excuse to avoid the expected foreplay of stretching or potential uncleanliness of anal, which many people find boring or unappealing. In heterosexual culture, anal is generally regarded as a lesser form of sex, the less real version, a simulation of genuine sex. Boy pussy resolves that conflict neatly by allowing people to have their cake and eat it too. Of course, I'm being a little abrasive about it. I think many people genuinely want to write positive representations of queer men and transmasculine people. Nobody goes into Omegaverse thinking like, gee golly, I can't wait to write trans men as outdated stereotypes of women. I've seen people call Omegaverse utopian, largely because it envisions a space where relationships of all combinations of primary genders are acceptable, where those who express primarily as women would face no gender discrimination as long as they express secondarily as alphas, and where men with vaginas and women with penises are an unquestioned fact of society. In a way, Omegaverse essentially seeks to de-queer the queer body, creating a world where trans-masculine people, and less often, though still notably trans-feminine people as well, are normative. So it's understandable that some trans people as well are drawn to the verse. It has this veneer of liberation, the insistence that you too belong in this society, that you are valuable, that you deserve to pass on your genes, that your genes are desirable, no less, against the backdrop of a real-life culture that generally considers your DNA unhygienic, and would deny you the rights to your biological children if you have any. But it is just a veneer. It's a repackaged version of biological essentialism, of the extremes of patriarchal hierarchies extrapolated to their most violent possible form. Alphas and omegas, regardless of their primary gender, are still expected to be together, are inextricably drawn to one another. They are physically required to be together and to breed. You can belong to this society, but you will always be dictated by your biological, genital reality. You exist for reproduction, and participating in reproduction is your requirement to participate in society. A common trope of Omegaverse is the shunning of omegas who seek to cast off their roles as breeders, only to be subjugated and mentally broken by alphas. The Omega man is barred from the privileges of masculinity. His manhood is theoretical to the extent that Omega feminization is more or less the rule. We are implicitly meant to understand these men as women, based on their genitals and hormone levels, and the premise of Omegaverse that we are asked to accept, even when we see more tolerant and progressive interpretations, is that these people, whatever we call them, are made to be degraded, that they are inherently subservient, and even though they may make rules and pills to deny that reality, to curb that animal instinct, at the end of the day that's all just an act, a cover for the natural order. But when sexual reality overwhelms them, urges towards procreation, society is meaningless, and that violence is all that exists. And fuck that! For those reasons, I'd always been uncomfortable with Omegaverse, even as I understand why some people would find solace or even empowerment in it. To me, it's always seemed to be coming at the expense of people like me. People who only exist in the minds of other fans as a fetish or a tool to gain brownie points. And at the expense of queer cis men for whom supposedly pro-gay fandom can be almost as alienating as the culture they're trying to escape from. Like yaoi before it, in many ways Omegaverse seeks to explore the degradation of patriarchal femininity, sexualize it and control it and consume it through the filter of queer men. And in so doing, these works render their subjects, gender non-conforming men, trans masculine people, etc., as concepts, depersonalized, things to project on, rather than a series of experiences outside of oneself, ones that might take a little work to understand. It is an entitlement to everyone's experience, to invent the other whole cloth as a method to make your own experience easier to digest. So, what does it mean when they decide they don't need the other after all? Part 4. The goddamn straight people. When I first heard about Het Omegaverse, because I'm a reasonable person, my assumption was that the majority of it would be like alpha female femdom mommy kink stuff. Obviously I was mistaken. Now, I haven't done the research to back this up, but I'm pretty sure the popularity of Het Omegaverse is mostly Reylo's fault. Of course, the concept existed well before the Star Wars sequel trilogy even came out, but I'm literally positive they made it blow up like an Omega womb inflated with seed. Ugh. Source: dude, trust me. Reylos love pregnancy fetish, and they love all of that 1950s style gender degradation shit, and they've been a major contingent of MF shipper people since 2015. If I know anything about the Addison Kane drama, it's that Het Omegaverse really popped off around that time, and it's only gotten bigger since, to the detriment of all of us. Am I bitter that one of my favorite authors on AO3 dropped everything I followed her for and started writing exclusively Reylo pregnancy fetish porn? Yes! Jokes aside, while watching Lindsay Ellis's Omegaverse video, I found myself wincing at a couple comments she made about Het Omegaverse and its relationship to MM.
Especially, according to Kane, in the MF field, what in the fanfic world is called het, because fanfiction is one of the rare arenas where heterosexual couplings are actually in the minority. So Kane claims that she innovated invading queer spaces and making them all normie and het.
This is by no means a call-out for Ellis, who by her own admission is not very involved with fandom and doesn't use AO3. It's just that I think to a lot of people who don't know Omegaverse very well, it seems very convenient to frame MM content as queer and liberating, versus het as for the streets. From within this phenomenon, having read a lot of it for research, I think I object to that framework. Plenty of people who write MM Omegaverse are straight. Plenty of people who write Het Omegaverse are queer women. So much less separates het and MM than a superficial analysis would suppose. In a way, if the appeal of Omegaverse is exaggerating gender inequality, Het Omegaverse becomes the natural conclusion. Something that I think is important to note is the shift in focus between gay and straight Omegaverse. While MM Omegaverse generally places emphasis on the Omega, on the caricature of his femininity, stature, vulnerability, and reactions, in opposition to the patriarchal but normative alpha, Het Omegaverse caricatures the masculinity and violent domination of the alphas. Female Omegas, by contrast, generally fit the typical erotica protagonist mold. Strong-willed, but ultimately damned by their own Omega bodies and their relationship to a gendered society. As in much forceful het erotica, the core appeal of Omegaverse is irresistibility. In Holly and Hensley's study, Social Dominance and Forceful Submission Fantasies, a study of roughly 800 hetero or bisexual university-aged men and women showed that, based on participant reports, the feeling of being overwhelmingly desired, especially being desired by someone with prestige, is the main draw of submission fantasies and of literature with this theme. Also, just because this is a fun little factoid, apparently men overall had more positive responses to submission fantasies where they are pursued forcefully by women. The researchers theorize that men are more likely to receive sexual rejections than women due to women being the selective party. Think of Tinder, for example. And so being the pursued party and removing the possibility of rejection highly appeals to especially less secure men. Which begs the question, why are we not making more femdom-led erotica for men? I got your back, boys. In Omegaverse, rather than unnatural beauty or a disarming personality, what makes the Omega irresistible is her heat. A biological phenomenon totally out of her control, one that she usually seeks to suppress with medication. Combined with Illois's theory on the appeal of patriarchal control fantasies, Het Omegaverse and other extreme heterotica becomes coherent. It isn't that readers and writers of the genre are necessarily anti-feminists and tradwives, though of course some are, or that they blame victims or secretly desire to be victimized. In an increasingly alienated society, of course it makes sense for people to gravitate towards fantasies that make such alienation impossible. It wrongly identifies the source of that alienation the same way incel fantasies of government-issued wives do, but it is still a kind of palliative. These stories are also a method of processing people's complex emotions and relationships to womanhood, especially for women who mostly date men and struggle to identify with a man. Honestly, I think I have much gentler feelings towards Heteromegaverse than I do for its Slash counterpart, because it does seem more, well, honest. Sure, you still get some posturing about how feminist and liberating it is by virtue of being porn for her, but there's much less overall waffling than there is by cis women writing about gay men. They know what they want, and they're not afraid to say it. It's an Own Voices project about representing the desire to feel wanted. Whether or not I think forced fantasies are good or healthy, or something we should personally interrogate, I understand internalizing them. At the end of the day, Heteromegaverse is basically just mainstream erotica with a sprinkling of dog dick and magical contrivances. By breaking down the comfort barrier present in Omegaverse, it helps reveal that the wall was there in the first place, and lets us understand what it's for. Part 5. Transformative Fiction. As harsh as I've been throughout this video, it would do my fellow creators a disservice if I didn't at least talk about the most challenging part of Omegaverse, that being the stories that are actually good. Anytime a trope gets too popular, there will inevitably be a backlash to it. Subverted Omegaverse is gaining popularity. Initially, most versions of it were flush with non-con and public claiming, but much of that has given way to modern Omegaverse, featuring fights for sexual equality, hormone suppression, and non-traditional couplings, alpha-alpha, omega-omega, and betas with alphas or omegas. The landscape of Omegaverse is expanding. One example that I always think about, even though it's not the most progressive, was actually from a doujin that revolved around an alpha-beta couple struggling against social pressure and jealousy in a way that felt like a very honest queer experience, translated through this fantasy setting. As I said, I've read a lot of Omegaverse, and every now and then you find someone who is making fucking art. Even if it doesn't exactly always reach high literature, a serious Omegaverse has genuinely thoughtful world building, as the story becomes about wrestling with its own setting. I'm obviously not the first person to figure out that Omegaverse is like hella sexist, and that yaoi is pretty homophobic, etc. I'm the loudest person with the most opinions, but I'm far from the first. A lot of those people have chosen to interrogate Omegaverse as a method for interrogating our own world, the way we deal with sex and gender. What could society be like if sexual morphs and gender roles were as rigid and enshrined as conservative propaganda wants us to believe? How would we fight back against that if somehow it turned out to be true? How could we find and claim our worth irrespective of a biological reality that objectively tells us what our worth is? And on a meta level, how do we as queer readers interact with erotica? Where is the line between celebrating and fetishizing when you are writing about a fantasy of yourself? I think from here, from where we are now, the most fertile place for serious Omegaverse to go would be to explore what transness would look like in Omegaverse. You know, how could someone transition from one primary or secondary sex? How would people express genders beyond the socially accepted combinations of male, female, and alpha, beta, omega? How would people react to those expressions in a society that is already inherently non-binary but still rigidly structured, and so on? I'm sure some people have already started digging into this idea, but once it becomes something firmer in people's minds, that's when I think Omegaverse will really break into its full potential as a transgressive, truly transformative genre. Part 6. Conclusion. I should reiterate here that the identity of the author isn't what I'm looking to criticize. There's just as much to analyze from a queer perspective, whether the author is trans or cis. The fantasy of extreme submission, extreme desirability can be just as potent for trans writers and audiences to indulge in. But I also believe that thoughtless sex positivity is just as harmful as sex negativity. Either perspective invests an incredible amount of power into sex, while preventing us from actually having a productive conversation about it. I mean, fuck, something isn't liberating just because it makes you wet. Something being empowering doesn't just mean it makes you feel powerful. I want us as people in fandom to really think about sex and the way we talk about it. I want us to create an environment with shades of grey for once. If we can't be reflective and critical about something as silly as Omegaverse, if we can't engage with someone pointing out its problems without becoming defensive, how can we expect to be level-headed and critical about serious issues like racism or underage content in our spaces or predators? I know that fandom is the place where we escape and turn our brains off, but what does it mean for us if we're willing to let our escapism come at the expense of others around us? We should be having more difficult conversations and approaching more topics with open minds. We can't expect to be seeing Grace e-bookses around every corner, convincing ourselves that the other person is baiting us in bad faith. It isn't fair to them or to us, and we're smart enough to know better. So now that I've completely alienated my potential viewership, go ahead and dislike this video and leave a rude comment about me. I seriously need the engagement. If you liked this video for some reason, I'd love if you liked and subscribed, and maybe check out my Patreon. I'd love to do more essays as well as some shorter stuff like book and movie reviews in the future. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you. You should have been a mother. You should have been a wife. You should have been gone from here years ago. You should be living a different life. Who's gonna take you home tonight? Who's gonna take you home? Who's gonna take you home tonight? Who's gonna take you home? Does God bless your transsexual heart? True trans soul rebel.